Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. So we're ready to start our second session for the day, which will be about public perceptions of immigration in a new security world. And we have two distinguished speakers with us today. We have first Jack Jadwab, who is currently the president of the Association for Canadian Studies and the Canadian Institute for Identities and Migration. He has led the Association for Canadian Studies for quite some time, right, since '98. He previously served as executive director of the Quebec branch of the Canadian Jewish Congress. And Jack holds a PhD in Canadian history from Concordia University and, well, has many, many other great accomplishments. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Jack, who's going to present on public perceptions of migration and security in Canada.
So thank you very much, Alessandro. It's very nice to be here. I want to thank Galia as well for the invitation. And I'm going to cut to the chase. You know, time's of the essence right now. I don't want to keep people too far away from lunch. So what I'm going to show you is some research that we've been conducting really over the past 7 years. It's by and large a series of surveys that have a tracking, if you like, accompanying them, that has been funded by Public Safety Canada, which is quite interested, of course, in security issues, and we've been doing these very detailed surveys to try to understand, or if you like, unpack some of the issues underlying anxieties about terrorism and what types of measures Canadians prefer to combat terrorism. And in the context of doing these very detailed surveys, we've also been looking extensively at issues of migration and how they play into anxieties about security. So you're going to see the most recent wave of survey data that we've done, which is last March, but you'll also see some tracking going back to 2012 in terms of the way in which public opinion in Canada has evolved around some key issues that touch on the relationship between migration and security. So that's the, briefly, that's just a methodology for the most recent survey we've done. As I said, we've done 10 waves of the survey from 2012 to 2017. Or 16 rather. The 11th wave was the one we did between March 13th and March 24th of this year. They're all done via web panel. About 2,500 respondents, or over 2,500 respondents were surveyed in this latest run. We had some enhancements, if you like, or oversamples for youth 18 to 34, for Muslim respondents and Jewish respondents. That is to say, those individuals identifying as either Muslim or Jewish in the web panel. Right, so this is just to give you some general sort of, before we get into the relationship between migration and security, just a general overview of what our survey findings tell us about opinion in Canada around immigration. Actually, the timing is pretty decent for the presentation because 48 hours ago, our government came with, Government of Canada came with the multi-year immigration levels proposal. Usually at the federal level, at our national government, we do annual migration estimates or levels in terms of what our expected intake is going to be, which our government is up to about 300,000. Previous government was about 275. This government bumped it up to 300,000 per year, but now they're actually projecting going up to 340,000 per year by 2020, which some would say flies in the face of global trends in Western democracies that are immigrant-receiving democracies that are less likely to say they want increase in numbers, even though, as we've seen in the case of Italy, they need more immigrants, right? But so here's just the sort of way public opinion shakes out in terms of various dimensions of attitudes towards immigrants, right? We're not in the security issue yet. by and large, when you ask this question, whether there are too many, too few, or about the right number of immigrants coming to the country, about 39% feel there are too many, 10% too few, 41% say the number is about right. I would say en parenthèse, just as a side note, this doesn't mean Canadians have a precise idea of how many immigrants are actually coming to the country, because we've done a fair bit of surveying in that area, and generally people underestimate the number of immigrants coming to the country. And when you give them the right number, it shifts opinion, but I don't think we need to be too bothered about that particular aspect of the issue. This is more about a feeling as opposed to knowledge about the numbers. Opinion of immigrants. Actually, opinion of immigrants is generally positive, right? About 75% of Canadians, when we roll together the very positive and the somewhat positive, which is sort of a way in which a lot of pollsters approach these questions. They roll up the positives and roll up the negatives. You get about 75% in the positive area. Relations to immigrants and non-immigrants, 60% of Canadians think they're positive, right? 10, 14% very positive, 47% somewhat positive. Contact with immigrants, sorry to run through this quickly, but if you want me to slow down, I will, but then I'll keep you away from lunch further, and Karen's presentation may be shorter, which we wouldn't want. Contact with immigrants, 40% say they often have contact, 33% occasionally have contact. So, Canadians have a fair degree of contact with immigrants. Now, keep in mind that over 20% of our population is foreign-born, about 22% as of the census released 2 weeks ago. About another 20% are children of immigrants, what they call in Europe, if you like, what's the term we use in Europe these days? We don't call them children of immigrants, actually. We say they're second-generation immigrants. Right? Which I've always found to be an oxymoron, by the way, because I'm second generation. I don't consider myself an immigrant. So I'm always challenged when I deal with my European colleagues. What do you mean second generation immigrant? That's like an oxymoron for me. Anyway, that's another story. And then we get into this sort of very standard question. Immigrants should be encouraged to give up their customs, traditions, and become more like others. And on that one, 47% say no, 36% say yes. That question's usually asked differently. I actually adjusted it. Usually it's put in an agreement battery. You strongly agree and somewhat agree. I've been making some adjustments to our questions, even though they're tracked, and changing some to yes and no, as opposed to strongly or somewhat agree, or strongly disagree and somewhat disagree. But it's yes or no. Now, if you ask Canadians, it's important for me to transmit my customs and traditions to my children, 67% say yes. So what I have found in some of the surveys is a lot of people say yes, it's important for me to transmit my customs and traditions to my children, but I don't want immigrants to necessarily do that. Right? There's about a 20-point gap in that regard. Wrong way, right way. Right, relations between immigrants and non-immigrants. So just to give you an idea here, this is a sort of a cross-tabulation of the data. In your opinion, do you feel do you feel that there are too many immigrants, too many, too few, about the right number, too many, and the extent to which people who feel there are too many think relations between immigrants and non-immigrants are positive or negative? Not surprising, right? That those people who feel that there are too many immigrants are more likely to think that relations are more tense than those people who feel that there are too few or about the right number. Opinions of selected groups in Canada. So these are opinions of selected groups in Canada. They're very positive. Again, getting into those roll-ups, the total positive. 72% as we see positive of immigrants, 63% positive of refugees, so a 9-point difference. Muslims 55%, atheists 63%, Jews 74%. So Muslims is the lowest at 55%. It was, by the way, because we've done about 6 years of tracking, it's generally been between 35 and 45% in terms of positive views of Muslims. It actually went up to 55% after the shooting, some of you may have heard of, in Quebec City, which is our provincial capital, by a young non-Muslim, of 6 Muslims at a mosque. Suddenly, opinion of Muslims went up. There was a lot of positive messaging on the part of our government. It's kind of a sad statement when it takes this type of incident for this to occur, but I'm quite certain that it's probably back to about 45%. Right, in terms of the level of positive opinion, because what our polling has shown over 10 waves is that opinion is very affected by events. Right? So if I go to the field after the shooting in Boston, then opinion will fluctuate, and it takes a few months before it reaches the normal level, if you like, of fear. And I know that may sound a bit paradoxical, but there's a normal level or benchmark level of fear when we do this polling around terrorism and counterterrorism. So, see, there's the trending for opinion of Muslims, 46, 46, 46, 35, 43, up to 55 in March 2017. But the trend line, 46 is about the benchmark. If it goes below 46 or above 46, that means something's happening that's affecting opinion at a particular time. Right. More negative about immigrants equals more negative about Muslims. So you could see that, when I take the people who are very positive about immigrants, about 90%, 66, 20, about 90% are very positive about Muslims. The people who are very negative about immigrants, hold a very negative attitude towards immigrants, are quite, in the inverse, 90% are very negative about Muslims. Now, the reason I do this, I know the discussion today is about security and migration, but I wanted to show you the convergence between, Muslim and immigration and security, right? Because there is, in the mindset of many Canadians who are more anxious about terrorism, and there is this underlying feeling that equates sort of immigration. When you think about it, we're thinking about Muslims, right? So we're trying to understand the extent to which that's occurring in our polling. So we continue. Right, not surprising. Those who feel there are too many immigrants, or excuse me, those who feel that immigrants should give the customs and traditions are more likely to feel there are too many immigrants. Right, so they are also making this connection between assimilationist ideas and too many immigrants, none of this being counterintuitive. Right, so now here's one, the Huntington thesis. I'm sure you've all heard of this, right, the Huntington thesis? Yes. So we've done this question 11 times, and it always comes out to about this, except March 2017, after the shooting in Quebec City. We went to the field within a week, and suddenly the Huntington thesis lost a little bit of support, but I'm ready to assure you that the next poll, which we have in the field right now, and we'll have results for next week, will probably back up to the 55, 56% that think, yes, no matter how I word the question, I've tried it 3-4 times, the Huntington thesis gains that much currency. Now, security issues. So before we sort of get to the bottom line, we're now on security. I'm then going to show you the relationship between the two. These are the questions we're asking. I have 5 minutes left? Yes. Oh my gosh. Okay, I'll go really fast. Get ready, folks. We're going really fast. Anxieties as regards the threat of terrorist activities around the world. So very worried has continuously gone up. And the very worried, is a function, again, very events-oriented, right, in terms of what's going on, what people are seeing, what images are being consumed via television or internet or so forth. I'm going to have to keep going fast and cut to the chase. Anxiety as regards the threat of terrorism in Canada, very worried and somewhat worried, 25, less, as you can see, than the international, right? About 16-point difference. So there's much more concern about what this phenomenon abroad. And Canadians have a tendency to think this is happening more outside of Canada than inside of Canada. Right? So terrorism declined. Has terrorism declined? Well, no, that's going down too. So no, if you tell people, hey, terrorism is declining, no. Very few people seem to agree with that. So now we get to the bottom line here. So this is, again, in Europe, levels of concern about foreign and domestic terrorism are roughly similar. This is from a Gallup June 2017 poll. This is more about layering, right? There's no correlation, no relationship between these three questions. It's just layering the responses, if you follow me, right? So it's not, you have to deduce the connection between concern about immigration levels and the issue or concern about terrorism by either non-residents or residents. Right?
I'm sorry, are those acts or that public opinion?
These are public opinion. So it's all public opinion, basically, and they're just layering the responses. They're not sort of making any connection. We're not seeing the people who, feel there are too many immigrants telling you what they think about terrorism, but we're being led to believe that there's a close relationship between them. And there is, actually. So here's where we look at the relationship, right? So if you feel there are too many immigrants, do you agree or are you worried about some of the following things based on these statements being submitted to you? And the one thing that I would suggest, and it's illustrated here, that really underlies what's going on in the mindset of a lot of people is there's a very substantial gap in the irreconcilable conflict area. Right, so that the more you think there are too many immigrants, you are much more likely to think there's an irreconcilable conflict than than if you feel there are not enough immigrants, or if you feel that the number is just about right. Elsewhere, the difference is, that's in the column on the right, very right. Elsewhere, the differences are less substantial when it comes to perceptions about what the government's doing to fight terrorism, whether terrorism has declined or not declined. You know, generally people feel it's on the rise, independent of these attitudes. But what's really seemingly the thing that, I got it, I'll really go fast. What's really sort of the underlying issue here is perceptions about Islam, is the irreconcilable conflict that's really driving anxieties. Right? So in some ways, immigration or migrants, for many people, is a bit of a euphemism for either Muslims or conflict with Islam. Right? That's sort of driving people's anxieties more than any other factor. Right? So that said, you know, these are also not unimportant. Right? The fear about terrorism is also showing there's also quite substantial difference in terms of that fear, which is also driving anxieties about immigration. But you know, it's not disconnected by any means from anxieties about Muslims and Islam. Then it's too many immigrants coming to Canada. So now we're looking at the extent to which people are, you know, very worried about terrorist activities and what's driving some of that. And people, the sort of highest marker here is having a very negative view of immigrants is a thing that's also driving concerns, as we said, about terrorism. But underlying that, again, all my data showing is fear and anxiety about Muslims and or Islam. Had contact. So now I'm looking at various other things, contact with immigrants and how that affects opinion. Since I don't have time to do this, I also want to point out that in this, on the oversample, if anyone wants to do this sort of dichotomous approach and say it's immigrants versus Muslims, actually, the Muslim Canadians surveyed here also have similar levels of concern about terrorist activities, right? So, which I thought it was an interesting thing to point out. Right, these are American worries about becoming a terrorist victim, 1 minute left, versus, and there's similar levels again of concern about terrorism both in Canada and the United States as a phenomenon. As a phenomenon, yes, people are not disputing or doubting that terrorism is being exaggerated, whether it is or isn't. You know, people fear its increase or rise, and you know that drives opinion independently in some ways of attitudes towards Islam. There's all similar levels of concern about the domestic or foreign expression of terrorism, terrorists from overseas versus, you know, the domestic-born or homegrown phenomenon. People who think there are too many immigrants are more likely to think that the phenomenon is coming from abroad than people who think there are about the right number or too few, or a little more likely to think there's a homegrown dimension to this that is as important. Okay, so we're going to just go through this whole thing. These are just questions about diminishing, what would diminish or encourage radicalization. Most people think these things would be more likely to encourage radicalization. And there are ideas that have been floated by our government and floated more seriously by the government here in the United States. But the one that is, I think, a little more likely to gain public sympathy in terms of the extent to which it's not felt to encourage the phenomenon of terrorism is the revocation of citizenship from individuals who choose to engage with a foreign army. I think I can do this in about 30 seconds. 0, okay. Okay.
Yeah, you can go ahead, 30 seconds.
Familiarity with requirements, okay. This is just about okay, so familiarity is not an issue. I've asked people, are you familiar with our immigration policies and our refugee policies? And most people think they are familiar, even though they're not, by the way. But they think they're familiar, but the familiarity doesn't affect their views. So, you know, people will not, we're not sort of seeing ignorance about the at least perceived ignorance about refugee immigration policy as a factor in this, even though it is a factor, by the way. It's just not a factor in the mindset of Canadians. Yes, so last one, good. I want to learn more about religions other than my own. This is the very last one, right? So basically, people who are very worried about terrorism, do they want to learn more about religions other than their own? 41% say yes. It's the ones who are not worried that are more likely to want to learn. And if I may say in a closing note, what I have found is, generally, the people who are most fearful of the phenomenon are the ones who say, I have very little contact with Muslims. I know very little about Islam. Do you want to learn more? No. This is what I see in the polling that I've done for public safety, which makes for a very important challenge if you think that one of the keys to, if you like, unblocking or diminishing anxiety, which the polls suggest, is learning more about the culture or religion, then you're going to have a very hard time doing it, because people who feel this level of anxiety are very entrenched in their view, don't want to learn more about it, don't know very much about it, and that's I think a part of the issue. Now, of course, they're also convinced that you're the ones who are being naive, right? That you don't know enough about it. If you knew more about it, even though they don't know about it, then you'd feel the same level of anxiety that they do, even though they don't know about it. Thanks.
Great. So the next speaker is Karen Snyder. She's a postdoc in the Department of Political Science. We are colleagues in the same department, where I'm a PhD candidate. She has a PhD from the University of Haifa. And you'll see she has a great interest in terrorism, immigration. And today she's going to present Afraid of Arabs and Attacking Asylum Seekers, Asylum Policy Attitudes Amid War.
Well, I can speak fast, but I'm not sure I can compete with you, Jack.
Lower the microphone.
No, I'm saying I speak very fast, but I don't think I can compete with that. And we need...
Okay.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Galia. And I am, as we heard, I'm also studying public policy and especially attitudes towards policy amid war. We've been talking about, in the last few days, we've been talking about two global phenomena occurring in the last few years, talking about the migration crisis, migrants arriving from specifically Middle Eastern countries, Africa and Western Balkan nations, flooding European and Western countries, and creating humanitarian crisis. And the other phenomena is the global terrorism one, attacking anywhere, everywhere. And for some reason, we had some guests over the last 2 days, these phenomena are linked together. It took a few days after the Paris attack to hear about the involvement of refugees, or accused involvement of refugees, and it took President Trump less than a day to release a statement after the unfortunate terrorism attack in New York a few days ago that we should consider migration policy again. And it bears to, since we are studying public attitudes, we are assuming symbiotic relations between the policy makers and the public, and we want to see how does that affect that the public. So the main motivation for the study was, do members of host countries react negatively to refugees and asylum seekers due to their exposure to violence event? And if so, what is the mechanism that drives that? Specifically, this study work on investigate the condition under which different level of exposure, high versus low, and I will explain this shortly, can lead to more exclusionist policy attitudes toward asylum policies. So the main questions of the study are, does exposure to local violence affect attitudes towards asylum seekers? And do perceptions of threat from issues regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict translate into support for harsh government asylum policy? Now I'm going to take you a little bit into the Israeli case study, and then I'm going to go back and try and convince you it's not only relevant to Israel. As you know, or as you're probably familiar, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict affects every aspect of the Israeli life, Israel and Palestinian life, but we're focused on the Israeli side right now. And being an external threat and daily terrorism and war feelings, let's say, we have the very complicated intergroup relations within the country. So we have the external threat, let's say, or the external exposure, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then we have two major minorities in Israel. We have the Palestinian citizens of Israel, also known as Israeli Arabs, and they are an existing internal minority. They born and raised in Israel, and they're a part of the society, but yet at times of war or time of terror, through the southern borders. Just Before we get into the study, I'll go quickly to the theoretical background. Exposure to political violence started to get attention after 9/11. More and more research were directed towards studying the effects of political violence on members of the societies that deal with that that kind of violence. What we're talking about when we talk about exposure to political violence is war, terrorism, even images of people kidnapped and soldiers or civilians and other forms of violence. They're all involved with the loss of life and financial damage. And what they found, all those studies, that exposure to political violence evoke a very wide range of responses that has an impact on the individual political behavior. After a terrorist attack, studies in the US, Israel, and Spain, for that matter, found ideological shift from towards more conservative opinion, short time, but still they found that. They found that people involved in those events reported higher PTSD syndrome and extreme stress conditions. Perceptions of threat were found to promote public support for aggressive security policy after terrorism attacks, and emotions such as anxiety, hatred, anger were shown to play a role in formating political intolerance within violent situation. Now, the other very strong predictor to out-group clash is threat perception. The fear that out-group members will harm the in-group members, harm them either financially or by security, or culturally threaten their way of life. So we have the realistic threat, talking about realistic threat that mentioning the competition approach. The outgroup might threaten our salaries, housing, elevate crime, and of course security. And the culture approach talks about there will be changing to the dominant culture of our country, change the language, values, the way we raise our children, etc. Now, the crossing point, when migration began to be included in the security concern, attitudes towards immigrants and immigration became very negative and common, and they started the securitization of migration. Basically, whatever they found earlier in the years about attitudes towards minorities, they found it against migration. Migrants were blamed for taking the in-group or the host country's work, and were threatening to their well-being. And this is where our study, or the study comes in. If the literature about exposure to political violence did not only recently started to understand the effects on migrants, they did very little on asylum policies. And on the other hand, the very large migration literature did not reference society under prolonged conflict. If they did it after random attacks, and not in the situation we are living through. So basically, we're presenting here the model that exposure to political violence affects attitudes towards asylum policies, and we also think perceptions of threat from issues regarding the conflict play a role in this situation. Now, a little bit about methodology. Measuring political violence, you can measure it in a different way. In the individual level, you can actually measure the proximity to the event, how far were you from the buildings of the twin buildings in 9/11, emotional impact, how did they impact the individual after the event. And in the group level, we measured exposure. You can measure it about how many rockets attacked, for example, your community suffered, or as we do in this study, we measure proximity to the area which suffered from rocket attacks from the Gaza Strip. I'll put it a little more clearly in this a map of Israel, we can see, I don't know how to push this, but we can see the Gaza Strip. Around it, you have 40-kilometer distance. That's the range, the rocket range, high level of rocket range. About a little bit more than 26 miles, and the rest of the country is a different level of exposure. What we did, immediately after the 2014 war between Israel and Gaza, we went to a college located in Sderot. Sderot is about half a mile from Gaza Strip, and we surveyed them. And we also surveyed a different group in Haifa University, which has about 150 kilometers. That's about 92 miles from the Gaza Strip. Basically, what we did, we created a geographical variation, high and low. Sample 150 students in each sample, did a cross-sectional design. And as I said, we did it immediately after the war. The war was between July and August 2014 for a month. We also, in another way to measure exposure to political violence is by simply asking people, were you, a member of your family or friends, were witnessing the attack, were they injured or killed, and if you or anyone that you know suffered from financial loss. The other predictor we think play a role here is threat perception. We use the validated scale regarding realistic and symbolic threat. Oops. What did I do? What we did is we measured perceptions of threat from Palestinian citizens of Israel. We did not ask about, we did, but I'm not presenting it here. We did not talk about perceptions of threat from asylum seekers. We asked them about an issue that is not connected, as I showed before, to asylum seekers. Palestinian asylum seekers do not bomb or make any violent act against Israel, yet we're measuring threat perception from the event in addition to the actual exposure to violence. Attitudes to asylum policies were not as easy to find the scale. After a few studies, we validated a new scale. If anyone would like, I will show them later. But we went into what exactly is asylum policies. Not only do you think there are too many or too little, also what do you think about how the policy about preventing? Do you think you agree to send them to detention? That was part of the Israeli policy in the beginning. Do you think they should be sent back, deport back? Or in the accommodation policy stage, if they're already inside the country, what should we do with them? Should we let them work? Should we send them back when the conditions are not right, etc.? We also control for socio-demographical variable, specifically political ideology. It played a significant role in the other two studies that we did for this research. And the result. We found differences between the two people in the two geographical areas. People who were highly exposed to political violence show more support for exclusionary asylum policies than people in the lower exposure area. And we saw higher, you can have the value here, but we see higher support, higher levels of perceptions of threat from PCIs compared to people who were in the lower area, exposure area. We ran a linear regression. I'm not going to talk about all of it, but you can see political ideology was a strong predictor through the study. Has its own place in the dissertation, but the geographical exposure to political violence was the main predictor. We also ran a path analysis, and we saw from the direct effect, we saw both measurement of exposure to political violence was predicting exclusionary policies by itself. That's the last one. And we saw, but once we introduced the mediation effect, we can see both measurement of exposure were, perception of threat mediated the relationship between exposure and asylum policies in both measurement. And I think this is where I can take you out of the Israeli scene and try and convince you that what we see with the perceptions, with the play role by perceptions of threat, is that there's a spillage of the conflict. It's not only to be exposed, you are exposed to violence that affect your attitudes toward asylum policy, but it's also issues related to that. So when we blame minorities or migrants, when we connect them in the way we frame it in the media that we heard yesterday, when we introduce them as part of the terrorist attack in any way, we are adding the perceptions of, we are using their perceptions of threats towards asylum policies. In conclusion, as we see more and more that migration phenomena is not going to go away, it's not going away, and on the other hand, we more and more societies are living with terrorism, and I think we reveal the way exposed members of host countries deal with the stressful effects of terrorism, and perceptions of threat play a significant role. And just for the last note, I think it's important for all parties to recognize the potential lethal danger which arises when fears about asylum seekers are being used and portrayed when they treat individuals, especially in a society that's already gripped by fear. That was fast.
Okay, so let's see, do we have any questions?
Yeah, this is for both presenters. Thank you. You both sort of get at the time issue with, you talk about after the terrorist attacks, or in the case of a positive feeling after the mosque shootings in Quebec City, that there's a shorter term effect. And I guess I'm curious about your thoughts on that, since it's relevant to both. I mean, like Snyder, I wonder, did you look at sort of over time how this operates? And then, given that there's this empathy effect in Canada, could there be an empathy effect going on as well? Considering these were asylum seekers, so they're fleeing political violence, which is a bit ironic. I guess I'm wondering if there's a time effect. Does it operate the same with empathy and fear? And what you thought about the dynamics of that? Thanks.
Yeah, I do think there's a time effect that operates with both empathy and fear. It's hard to pin it down to how much time it would take, to be honest. We've done 10, 11 surveys. I like to sort of, when I deal with policymakers, or suggest it's 3 months, but I'm saying that, sort of not half jokingly, but appreciate the seriousness of the matter. It's hard to pin it down, but there is the effect of both. And, what we did see after in terms of the empathy effect, after the shooting in Quebec City, was that our politicians, many of our politicians came out, made very positive statements, very positive messaging about the need for greater understanding. So there was a lot of media. But, anyone was naive enough to think that was going to stick, and that attitudes wouldn't revert to where they were in the space of a few months. I think learned otherwise. And, now our politicians are being, again, more cautious. Although we've got, a cool Canadian Prime Minister in Justin Trudeau, who says a lot of, I think, nice, fine things. But, he's going to continue to have to navigate some very challenging waters in terms of the state of public opinion and what, may or may not emerge when public opinion can be very incident, affected.
Well, about time, then you're right. We did a survey and did a study 2 years after the war, exactly to understand the long-term effect. And I can tell you that 2 years again, but Israel is not a time. Every few months you have some incidents, so it was reasonable to amount of time, we saw a reduced effect of exposure to support for asylum policy, but because there were very few lost casualties in Israel on the Israeli side, we had to we divided exposure into your financial exposure and loss of life. If you knew someone who lost anyone, and then we saw only people who had financial loss were more threatened by Palestinian citizens of Israel, and then supported exclusionary policies, and there was no direct effect anymore between the exposure and the support policy. About empathy, I am not aware of empathy studies. We do measure willingness to peace and issues like that, but again, since the asylum seekers are a completely different group, there's no connection, supposedly no connection between the conflict and the asylum seekers, but as we see, it's very connected. So empathy, I'm sorry to say I don't bear the news, but we can all go there if we can.
No,
Yeah.
we got our problems too, so we're not busy with that.
Got ya.
So, thank you, great presentations, and I'd love to see more of the data. I just wanted to raise one question and make one point. I think that it's very interesting as we heard these presentations from countries outside of Europe, I guess, and not the United States, in case of Israel, in case of Canada. It reminds me, and it should remind all of us, how global migration really is. I mean, the fact that Israel has been experiencing these asylum seekers is actually pretty much related to what happened in Italy and Europe, right? The fact is that asylum seekers are now making their way through the desert, right, when the other routes are closed in Europe. As they're tightening in Europe, they're coming closer to countries that were never asylum countries other than after World War II. And the same as Canada. Canada's obviously experienced really quite a reaction on migration, coming also from what's happening in the United States as the borders have closed down. So I think that this interconnection, the globality of what's happening is really important. However, I want to ask a very general question. As a public opinion expert myself on migration, I'm often asked this, so I want to put this on you. How we understand some of these attitudes, public opinion over time, and to a fair degree, we can really make some generalizations about drivers of public opinion over time, ideologically, security-wise. But I wonder, what are the implications of public opinion on the policies that we're seeing? I mean, yes, for example, we understand that the Brexit, right? The Brexit was a very unique moment in time where public opinion seemed to really matter. But and as I think Jack mentioned, you see all these dips over time on different security breaches. But at the end of the day, how much does it really matter? Where do we put public opinion in all this?
Well, the work I'm doing is being commissioned by a branch of my government, so, and it's much more detailed than, what I pulled together like on Wednesday for you here. So I like to give myself the illusion that, it is providing some support for some of the language in terms of what our officials and policymakers think the public is or is not receptive to by way of initiatives that may or may not be pursued, by way of investments that are made in trying to help improve understanding, if you'd like, between different communities. We have questions about, and we've been tracking on, the extent to which people would be willing to accept violations of civil liberties in order to, combat terrorism. And we see that about 1/3 of Canadians are willing to accept that. If you're more fearful about the phenomenon of terrorism, you're much more willing to accept that. And we've had debates about those issues in law. So, I do think that our policymakers, and more so our elected officials that sort of drive what some of the bureaucracy does, is very interested in this type of information. I can tell you causally whether, what we're measuring is sort of affecting directly a policy decision that's being taken. And, it's not good to govern by polls, to be fair, If you govern by polls, then, I don't want to refer to what's happening in the United States, because, I don't want to offend anyone's sensitivities here, but, there are risks when you do that. But, still having the information, I think, is important, so.
I wasn't contesting the.
No, I didn't, just saying.
But I'm often also asked about one, is there really a channel for public opinion to affect policies? We're sitting here trying to think of how we can best practices to manage like the issues here. And we're kind of starting to wonder where can public opinion really change things, other than us changing public, and even so, where does that take us?
Well, I can at least, I share what Jack said, and I can at least give you an example from the Israeli policy, since it's a very new one and evolved in the last 8 years. From 2006 to 2010, there were maybe 2,000 asylum seekers, again, walking from Sudan and Eritrea through Egypt and entering Israel. There was no border. By 2010, it began a wave of 25,000 people a year. Got to 2015, around 100,000 asylum seekers in a country of 8 million. And until the numbers grew, first of all, they were sent to the center of the city. So in Tel Aviv, we had asylum seekers sleeping in backyards of people, and you saw them in the streets. There are no dark-skinned people in Israel as much, so suddenly you had a flood in the streets, and only when the citizens of Tel Aviv started to raise their voices did the policy change. Until then, it was okay, we signed on the petition for refugees to let them in until we sort out what's going on in Africa. We'll let them stay. It was a situation that it wasn't possible anymore. And then you start hearing politicians threatening the whole Africa is on the way to Israel, let's stop it, it's endangered. Almost immediately, if you can believe, a fence was built in Israel, Egypt, that was never there. The asylum seekers were sent to detention. In the beginning, the threat was for 3 years. And then the policy started evolving, and then you see NGOs interfering on behalf of the asylum seekers. What do you mean 3 years, men, women, and children in detention, and it started to change again, and now it's a fight between the Supreme Court and the government. But I definitely see a connection. It's not causing, I'm not saying it's causing, I hope one day, but at least we understand what the public gets from the policymakers and what the policymakers gets from the field, and that's how I see it.
Karen, I wanted to ask you one question. In your university sample, was there any subsample of Palestinian citizens of Israel?
Yeah, we specifically surveyed Jewish civilians because we wanted to see the effect on the role played by perceptions of threat. We do have other polls about Palestinian civilians in Israel, but not in issues regarding asylum seekers. This is a...
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine they might feel threatened as well.
Exactly. I mean, they
Maybe
speak...
even more so.
They speak Arabic, for example, and people from Sudan, but they're not going into Arab villages or countries. They're staying in the center, since Israeli Arabs are afraid also. It's not because we all share the same belief, or I'm not even sure about that they go together. But we wanted to see the effect of, as I said, the spillage of the conflict in an issue of perceptions of threat, and you cannot ask Israeli Arabs about Palestinians. We asked them other things, but this was specifically Jewish population.
I'm wondering, it's an interesting question, but you can ask them whether they feel a perception of threat because they're situated.
We do, but I can elaborate later, but we do, it's just not, it wasn't related to the asylum policy. Again, there's a lot of discussion in Israel being refugees only 70, 80 years ago. How was Israel supposed to accept those asylum seekers? On the other hand, can only be a citizen or a refugee, specifically a citizen if you're Jewish. So there's no future for asylum seeking in Israel since you cannot become a citizen unless they change the law of return and the law of visitor. So it's a very complicated issue, but within that, we try to map it.
Yeah.
I guess I'd like to just ask one more question. I'm thinking about, I very much appreciate the security element, and I like also in your diagram again, the intermediary effective threat perception, and this is an issue that I wanted to discuss also with Jack. We started to talk about this. My curiosity is, to what degree do threat perceptions really influence the reactions of people between anger and fear, right? So my sense is, and that's what I saw in your chart, the ideological variable might really run along that people that are threatened either are reactive, right? They're either angry and reactive, or they are fearful and they want to sort of stay away from further, and they're closed in for further trouble. And maybe that's where really the line is of this threat perception. That's where the divisions are, and the security element plays a role. I would wonder if you might see some ideological sort of variation based on that.
We did, the first two studies that we did were a comparative study between Israel and Australia, for example, having high level of exposure and low level of exposure by the fact that Australia doesn't have a conflict and Israel does. And we saw that right-wing political ideology drives attitudes towards asylum seekers, but it's also, they're reporting higher perceptions of threat from asylum seekers. We didn't introduce Palestinian civilians of Israel, obviously, for Australians, but we wanted to see, and definitely, as I showed, again, not a lot of attention to it, but political ideology is one of the best predictor we found. Left people or liberal tend to fear less or be less threatened by issues of asylum seekers or Palestinian civilians of Israel, and to support less exclusionary policies towards asylum policies.
I guess, Jack, if you're going to answer me, I think the division that I'm trying to make is that threat actually creates anxiety or creates anger, right? We hear security breach, the New York City event. Some people really react in anger. They want to do something. Keep asylum seekers out, keep all outside, any threat outside. And others want to really avoid it, maybe to deal with the problem, much more quietly and maybe resolve it.
I mean, I've thought about this, because we've had this discussion before, I've thought about this in terms of attitudes versus behaviors, as a, and what you're saying being an expression of the attitude versus the behavior. Because when we're looking at our attitudes, we can ask behavioral type of questions, but even if we do that, it's not necessarily a predictor of how people will behave. But from a policy standpoint, I think my government in particular, which does want to raise immigration levels, and has raised immigration levels, though gradually, if they had their choice, by the way, since we feel for demographic reasons we need more immigration, they probably would have gone to higher levels. But because they feel, based on what they're seeing, that there's the potential for some volatility in public attitudes, and the behavior would be that people will risk voting for political parties that offer other types of visions that are inconsistent with what Canada wants to pursue, at least the government of Canada wants to pursue currently. We're going to sort of examine what we can do in that context. So I think the feeling is we need to soften attitudes, make sure that they don't spill out into behavioral manifestations of anger that are directed at the ballot box somehow. And so that's sort of one dimension of this. I wanted to actually ask Karen a question. So I'm trying to understand, I have a little bit of familiarity with the context of it, because like Galia, I go for this one conference almost every year, right, on migration issues. How much does the fact that the spin being put by some of the Israeli politicians on these asylum seekers is that they risk being associated with Islam or Islamic ideologies coming from Eritrea, trumping the idea that, that Israel is found as a place, a haven, if you like, for refugees, and that's why there should be more empathy, we'll get back to the end of the issue, for this group of people. But that's being trumped by, politicians and thought leaders saying these people are terrorist risks. They're not Filipino migrants, right? Those aren't asylum seekers. But in terms of law of return,
They're not.
right, they have the same issue applies in terms of what you mentioned. They're not going to get Israeli citizenship
They're not.
because they don't fall within the law of return in both cases. But in one case, again, even though they're not asylum seekers, the Filipinos, right? They're migrants. People have a different set of issues involving them, but the spin being put on these asylum seekers is if they were domestic caregivers with the same type of expertise, they're asylum-seeking domestic caregivers, then I'm wondering if, the attitude would be different than if they're being spun as, And taking also into account, I'm not, Canada's not Israel. We're not in, the middle of the type of political violence that Israel encounters, and the security threat is a much more significant threat than it is in Canada, obviously. So,
But it's a very good question, and when we discussed yesterday framing, I was thinking about it. In Israel, asylum seekers are called infiltrators. Now, infiltrators is a common name for terrorists came in the 50s to attack Israel. For some reason, or on purpose or not, that's their name. Public do not call them refugees or asylum seekers; they call them infiltrators. And then immediately you put it into the scene of local violence and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But take also that they are physically look more than Israeli Arabs, then they look like Israelis. Speak Arabic, as I said. Some of them, not the majority, by the way, are Muslim. And the fact that Sudan is an enemy country to Israel, no relationship, and is being considered as enemy, and never had any connection with Eritrea. So put all of this together, and suddenly you understand why asylum seekers are treated like that. Empathy, again, that was a very big, there is a living discussion about how we should address them or not, but the law of return, especially for Jewish, is very certain. You cannot become a citizen if you're not Jewish. There were cases that Israel gave refugee status for Vietnamese, for example, in the 60s, and but
I think citizenship for professional basketball players, I think they gave a couple.
yeah, they gave also not asylum, not refugee, but they gave them.
Discretionary powers.
Exactly.
Any professional basketball players.
But still, you can definitely see why it's going towards the part of the Palestinian conflict.
Okay, thank you so much for your great presentations and also being on time and keeping everything within limits. Now I suggest we continue at lunch, right?
I would just like to say, everyone is invited, okay? Everyone.
Yeah, I'm still working today.